And talk to Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. Travis is a computer engineer from Los Angeles who, if I got it right, actually dropped out of school, not during the first year like some of his peers, but rather very close to graduation.
Yeah.
Why did you do that?
Well, I was running actually my second business at the time, and I started. A couple things happened. One, I started getting calls from the investors who'd put in $4 million while I was in physics lab, and that was kind of weird. And the other is I was starting to run out of time. I couldn't do homework anymore, and I'd go to and I was doing so much business that I'd go to my my college classmates, my classmates, and ask them if they could do my homework if I paid them $100. And then I realized I probably should not be in school right now. So, and then my mom got very upset. Yes.
Is it true that you already showed commercial talent as a school kid when you sold knives in a door-to-door operation?
Travis sold knives. He was a knives dealer. Yes, I did sell kitchen knives to homemakers across Los Angeles. It was the summer between high school and college. And I had a couple things going on. One was I was selling knives, and the other was I was tutoring SATs, which is a college entrance exam. And the SAT thing actually became my first business. Because I was teaching some kids. One of them did incredibly well, and then pretty soon I was teaching everybody, and then one of the fathers said, let's start a school. And so my freshman year in college, I actually started a SAT prep school. And that was my first entrepreneurial thing that had nothing to do with technology, even though I've been a coder since I was 11 years old and was an engineer at UCLA.
Your first company that became well known was a file sharing service. Correct,
yeah.
And this ran into all kinds of difficulties with both the music and the film industry.
Yeah.
And it went bankrupt because of that.
I like to say we filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Yep.
It was a strategic move.
All right. What, Travis, did you learn? What did you learn from that strategic move?
When you build something and you put your heart and soul into it, to see it go is a little bit of an emotional thing. So it's you learn that building companies is the same as building a relationship with a person, and you can be quite emotionally tied to the thing that you've built. And so that's what I learned. The last part of that company, it was hard to get out of bed in the morning, just because it was the end. So you can get a little depressed when things don't go well. And
the next company was one that actually catered, I think, to the music industry rather than be their opponent. And
the idea was to we were doing peer-to-peer file sharing in the first one, and we got in a little bit of trouble for that. And it was a $250 billion lawsuit. And by 33 of the largest media companies in the world. And so we decided, well, why don't we take this technology, which they didn't like us for, and why don't we take that technology and turn them into customers? The same stuff they sued us for, let's make it something they buy from us. And that's what we did on the second one. So it was like clicking on let's say you clicked on a video link. Let's just say hypothetically a YouTube link, you would click on it. And normally you'd pull the video from a server and you'd pull over large amounts of bandwidth, so they have big pipes and data centers to do all this. But what we do is you'd click on that link and instead you'd pull from other PCs that have already gotten that content, and therefore you could distribute content at zero cost. And that was the angle where we then sold it to the media companies that were previously not okay with that technology. And that's all one of those interesting things about how technology and the sort of optimistic or positive use of it always finds a way. And in many ways, YouTube is the other side of that coin, which is the thing that we got sued for, in many ways is almost identical to what YouTube is today. And so it ultimately finds a way, and business models and regulatory regimes and structures, they have ultimately find their way. I like to say that the rules and the world bend towards people and towards progress.
So
Eventually.
You sell this business for a modest 20-some million, I think.
Let's not forget the first 4 years I didn't have a salary. Right? Being too early to market is a tough thing. But yes, it was amazing that and by no means am I saying, oh, woe is me. It was hard, but it was one of the bigger accomplishments for myself was to see that one through.
And then you go to San Francisco. You move to San Francisco. And how did
I moved to San Francisco during that second company because I'd run out of money and my girlfriend lived in San Francisco.
Okay.
I didn't tell her that.
That was probably a very good move. And then this idea of Uber comes up. How did you come across the name, first of all?
So the name, well, a little bit about the idea. So it was a very simple idea. Push a button and get a ride. And we came up with the idea when me and my co-founder were in Paris, unable to get a taxi. I know none of you have had that experience before. And well, it was snowing, and it was like you could not get a taxi at 1 a.m. when it's snowing in Paris. There's no chance. But the name Uber started actually, we went to a website where you could type in a description of the thing that you were going to build, and it would show you names of domains that are available. And so we said, cab, awesome. And it said, ubercab.com is available. And so we bought ubercab.com, and 3 months after we launched in San Francisco, we got our first cease and desist, not our last, but our first, which basically said you can't use the word cab in your name because it's not a cab. False advertising. And so we took the cab off, and then we became Uber.
What drives you, as a serial entrepreneur? Is it what everybody in Silicon Valley says, to improve the state of the world, which you would have in common with the World Economic Forum? Or is it, you've said that at other times, also the sheer adventure of it, which I could easily understand? What is it?
It's, for me, it's certainly not the former. That's not where I start when I solve a problem. But actually where I start is a really interesting problem. What I like to say is it's sort of like a math professor. A good math professor is going to try to find the hardest problem that nobody's been able to solve. But if they solve it, it has huge impact. Just like has a wow factor. So as an entrepreneur, I'm just constantly pushing towards the really hard things. But also, it's not just any hard thing. It's a hard thing that if you solve it, there's like a wow factor. And that's how I do my entrepreneuring.
I don't have to tell you that, but you know that you have, for some reason, gathered a reputation for being rather aggressive, which is an art in itself in Silicon Valley, where everybody is pushing. But is Uber, because it has to go against all these local monopolies, so is it in itself a necessity to be aggressive with such a business model?
So first, if someone was aggressively chasing conventional wisdom, nobody would call them aggressive. But if you are aggressively trying to bring progress in a place where there is resistance,
there you go.
Then you might be called aggressive. And the thing is about progress is that there is resistance to it. So what we like to say is know what's right, fight for it, don't be a jerk. And that's kind of how we roll at Uber. But when you are fighting for things that are about change, and it is against conventional wisdom, it can be controversial. Yeah.
Peter Thiel, one of the first Facebook investor, said at one stage that Uber is, quote, the most ethically challenged company in Silicon Valley.
He's also the biggest investor in our competitor. That somehow wasn't disclaimed when he said it, nor was it in any of the articles.
One of the countries that you do run into difficulties or have run into difficulties is Germany. You had to pull out of a couple of cities, Frankfurt, Hanover, others. And I think you're still operating in 2 cities, Munich and Berlin. What was this German experience? Is it that they are too stubborn there, and that the monopolies, the existing monopolies, are sort of too much, or was it also Uber that maybe hasn't quite understood the way that Germany operates?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, we believe in what we're doing. We believe in the kind of progress we're bringing. I could certainly outline it if it were interesting, or if you were interested. Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both, right? We learn too.
So what have you learned in Germany or about Germany?
Sometimes patience is a virtue, right?
So you think that in the end, Germany is going to come around?
I think if all your borders are surrounded by the future and progress, then that's something that that the citizens will want, and they'll want it too. And I think that I think it's hard to say that pushing a button and getting a ride at half the price of a taxi, it's hard to say that that's a bad thing. And it's hard to say that creating tens of thousands of jobs in every city we go to is a bad thing. And it's hard to say that reducing pollution, drunk driving, congestion, traffic, and strain on parking infrastructure is a bad thing. And when you look to the future and you think about that world where you push a button and get a ride, and you get all of those other benefits, I'm trying to figure out why you wouldn't want that. And so eventually, it will happen. And that doesn't, every city, every country has its own time frame for bringing on progress and technology. I mean, let's be clear. Germany is the host of some of the world's great innovations and great technology. Maybe not in the taxi world, but in a whole bunch of other industries. And so every industry lobbies, every industry, incumbent industry will lobby their city council or their federal government to try to keep the rules in a certain way that help them win. It just so happens that in the taxi world that there's a lot of influence there. And I think ultimately the German political system will ultimately find that progress. And I believe that German politicians want what's best for their people, and it just takes a little more time, and that's okay.
Where do you feel most welcome in Europe?
There's a lot of countries we do well, right? So, believe it or not, we actually do quite well in France. We have a fairly large business in France. We serve the city of Paris quite well. We've created tens of thousands of jobs in that city. London, of course, is doing quite well as well. There's a number of Eastern European countries where we've grown quite fast. I think Lithuania was the first European country to adopt sort of nationwide regulations that sort of outline how Uber should work in their country, or things like Uber. And just remember, right, the rules, the old rules that we have today, way back, they were the new and controversial rules of their time. And every new rule has a right and a privilege to become an old rule and to ultimately get replaced by a new rule. And that's okay.
Let me put in, we have to talk about sort of the vision of where Uber is going in a moment, but I have one more question regarding this. Jeremy Rifkin, an American futurist, if you want, made the point that Uber may not be worth the 50 plus billion that it's sort of estimated at, because actually every local network of cab drivers could do the same thing. Is that true?
Look, I think the reason Uber works is because there are two things that make Uber really work well. One is what I call flexible supply, and the other is flexible price. And what I mean by that, flexible supply in a European context is freedom to establish. Like if somebody wants to go into business, they can, right? And the taxi system in almost every city in the world is characterized by fixed supply and fixed price. So Uber, when it can be cheaper than a taxi, will be cheaper than a taxi. Uber, when there can be more people served than the fixed number of taxis that exist, will make sure that there are more cars out there to serve the people that need a ride home. And if for whatever reason there aren't enough cars out, well, the price goes up so that more cars do come out, and so that everybody always gets the lowest price reliable ride. And so when you have a fixed amount of supply and a fixed price, you don't do well when there are too many cars, because then, of course, that means that not enough people are using it that would be using it, and of course, drivers are not making enough money in that situation. And you don't do well when there's too few cars, because drivers aren't getting enough incentive to be out there on the road, and riders can't get a reliable ride. And so flexibility is what makes it work, and it's not about a specific taxi or taxi driver, but instead what I would say is, remember, taxi drivers in most cases do not own the taxi. They work for a taxi company, and that taxi driver does not make a very good living. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a New York example, for instance. In New York, there are 13,250 taxis today. In New York, 60 years ago, there were 13,250 taxis. Why is that? Why are the same number of taxis today as there were 60 years ago? It's because they gave out free licenses.
And now
So people could, and then those license holders lobbied the city government to say we don't want any more. And then those license holders lobbied the city government and said we want to make them a tradable asset. And so the artificial scarcity meant that the price went through the roof. Why? Because a taxi driver who now does not have a freedom to establish, cannot just go into business for himself, has to ask for permission to drive a taxi. And the taxi owner says, of course you can, as long as you pay me $150 a day. And so that taxi driver spends $40,000 a year renting a car. That car should be like a Bentley or something, but it's not. And so there are two drivers for each taxi. That means the owner is making almost $100,000 a year renting a car out. And for that privilege, that taxi driver gets to be impoverished.
You take 20%
Yep.
of the fare.
Correct.
And of course, Uber drivers, they don't know how much time they can actually work per week, right?
They can turn, so people think of the on-demand economy, they think of, oh, I can push a button and get a ride. That's cool. But think about it from the other side. Think about it from the driver's perspective. Imagine if you could push a button and go to work. You just start working. And then you're not feeling it, you push a button and you stop, right? And think what that means for labor. Think what that means for the future of work when, for the first time ever, you have hyper absolute control of your time. You don't have to ask the boss, hey, can I go to the bathroom, or can I get a 5-minute break? You don't have to wait on call because they're going to call you, you might have to come to work today, and if you don't, you're going to get fired. You're in control of your time. So we're obviously very excited about that part, but I think most importantly, the drivers the folks who work on the Uber system are super excited about that.
If I was an Uber driver, I would be afraid of your newest vision on which you actually really work, which is a driverless car. Because all you're trying to do is make the driver useless.
Okay, I think that the intention you put on me is probably not how I would describe it.
It's not why you do it, but...
What I would say is that driverless cars, well, Google's been working on them since 2007.
And
why?
Have they done a good job?
We'll get to that in a second. They've been working on them since 2007, but for good reason. Why? Millions of people die a year in cars. They don't have to. Tens of millions of people get injured. Trillions of hours are spent sitting behind a wheel holding that steering wheel, stressed out. And we don't have to have traffic in our cities. And we could, that parking infrastructure, that's 15% of the land in a city, could be given back to the city. So there's all kinds of reasons. And by the way, imagine transportation that's so inexpensive that everybody could have access to it like running water. That's what we're talking about. And so you go, okay, that is an interesting vision, I think, that really Google started with when it comes to driverless cars. But now all the OEMs are there. Now, other companies are there. And so the question for Uber is a difficult one, but an interesting challenge. But it really is about, do you want to be part of the future, or do we want to resist it the way the taxi industry has? And so we say we want to be part of the future. And then you have an interesting problem to solve, which is, how do we optimistically lead through that? How do we partner with cities, given that this is going to happen for sure, with or without Uber, it's going to be a thing? How do we partner with cities, given how much a part of cities we are? And whether it's vocational training, education, transition period, which, by the way, is going to take many years just to transition, just because the technology is going to get there gradually, not like all at once. But also, the other thing is, when it happens, it's going to be so inexpensive that a thing like Uber or anything like it, will be huge. It will be a massive thing. And you could say, well, the human driver thing can happen right alongside the driverless thing. And the driverless thing will be so big that the human driver thing next to it will actually be quite small. Even though people think of Uber as being quite big, it will be quite small compared to what happens then. You say, oh, well, 5% of the cars could be human-powered. That's cool. And then, okay, so then the overall cost might be 3 or 4% more. So you don't necessarily, I don't take for granted that you have to, quote unquote, as you said, get rid of them. I think more importantly, you try to find a way to optimistically lead through it and find solutions to challenges, and that's what being an entrepreneur is all about.
I asked the Google question not because it's the elephant in the room, I just asked it because if you go into developing your own driverless car technology, which you are, it must be that you think there can be something done better, and there must be something that Uber knows that the other guys don't know, right? Is it what can be done better in developing these cars?
I mean, they don't even exist yet. You can't buy one. You can't use one. Yeah. So there's a lot that could be done better.
All right.
Yeah.
And
they're not even in the market.
And anything specific? I mean, any strength that you want to bring to the table?
No, it's okay.
No, okay. Travis, in the meantime, before we have the driverless cars going through our cities, what Uber is doing already is pooling people.
Yeah.
Which seems a very sensible thing to do, environmentally speaking, and so on. How is that going?
So, for those who don't know, we do this thing called Uber Pool. And the way Uber Pool works is you push a button, car comes, just like it did before, except you open the door. Excuse me, that Diet Coke, wow. You open the door, and there's somebody else already in the car. And so it's two people taking an almost identical trip at the same time. And now you've got one car instead of two, and you're really just taking cars off the road, but of course the price goes down. Price goes down, you get more consumers in it, and guess what? When you get more consumers in it, carpooling works better because it's more likely that two people are taking the same trip at the same time. And so in the cities we've rolled this out, like for instance in San Francisco, almost 50% of all rides we do in San Francisco are Uber pooled. Okay, we're taking cars off the road. And in the cities we've rolled out, for instance, in China, we've got Uber pool all over China. Almost 50% of those rides are Uber pool. And are we stopping there? No, it's like early days. I think ultimately could be 80 or 90% of our rides are carpooled. And what does that mean if you're a mayor or you're a transportation minister, when you can use the existing infrastructure that is there and do twice as much with it? What does it mean when instead of thinking about where do I get 10 billion euros for infrastructure to provide accessible transportation, when all you have to do is let Uber in your city and it's there? And we're not the only solution, we're not the perfect solution, but we're an important part of the suite of solutions.
It means, by the way, that the German car industry is going to have yet another problem, but that's only on.
Why is that?
Well, because there are going to be less cars sold.
Oh, I don't necessarily think that's true.
Okay.
Right? So if you are running something more efficiently and there's less traffic, you might be more willing to go somewhere more often than you would have before. And so then you go, well, there's more miles driven then. If more miles are driven, then you have more depreciation on a car. If the car is the same tomorrow as it was today, let's just say, and that's a hypothetical, of course, you're going to sell more cars. But that individual car is going to do a lot more miles. Now, when you do the carpooling thing, you are then getting some efficiency on those miles, and you have to compare the efficiency you get on those miles to how many more miles are going to be done. And I don't know it's the exact answer, but I think some of the doomsday scenarios that may have been painted by some folks are not necessarily accurate.
Thank you for keeping up the hope for our car industry. Travis, I like this guy standing next to you normally very much. Now I don't like to look at him anymore because this guy, because he has been telling us for the last 5 minutes that we have to stop.
Oh, we could just keep going. I mean, are they actually going to pull us off stage?
I don't know. I don't know. I like that. So we ignore him for one more question. Can we?
Okay.
You.
Our intentions are good.
You talked about the virtues of an entrepreneur recently. What, in a nutshell, makes an entrepreneur? What distinguishes an entrepreneur from, us other guys?
I think, there's so many ways to answer that. I talked, of course, about pushing hard towards a wow thing, an interesting thing. But I think maybe another way of looking at it, it's about risk and understanding risk. So there's two parts I want to say to that, and then we'll be done and we'll get off stage. But the first part is what I call perception versus reality. So conventional wisdom is perception. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes it's wrong. When conventional wisdom is really wrong, when this is conventional wisdom and when perception is here and reality is all the way over here, when it's a big distance between the two, I'd like to call that distance the innovator's playground. Because what happens is nobody's going over here. You go over here. You got to be good with everybody telling you you're wrong, and you better be frickin' right. If perception is reality and you're all the way over here, you are going to get run over, right? But so it's understanding the difference between perception and reality, and then ultimately it's about understanding risk. When people think there's a lot of risk in doing something, but you see reality, that's perception, and you see reality and it's actually very low, you go for it. When people see that there's something that's very low risk, but you know that it's high risk, you stay away from it. And every time you play that reality versus perception game and you get reality more right, you are innovating, you are creating, you're doing something very interesting. And the other part about risk that I think is important for entrepreneurs is that they understand risk better when it comes to their own personal life. So what I mean by this is, let's say I fail on a startup. Am I not going to eat? If you have to, could you go live back with your parents? You could. I did. Okay? So will you really not eat? Would you really not have a roof over your head? And if you have both of those and you still have friends and family, are you going to be okay? You will. And so what happens is the difference between an entrepreneur and a non-entrepreneur really comes down to that question, which is the assessment of risk and what it really means and the adventure that comes with doing something that other people think is too risky when you see promise behind it. And understanding that at the end of the day, you're going to be okay, and that there are a lot of people out there that have it way worse than you ever will. And your assessment of risk is all in your head.
Wasn't that worth it?
Absolutely.
Travis Kalanick, thank you very much.